Okay, so I've had a request for a video about identity and how and why we reflect on identity. So I thought I'd start off with power dynamics are in everything. Everything is like the oil that greases the wheels in everything, within our intimate relations, our social relations, institutional relations. But if they're functioning, we're basically not aware of them and shouldn't even be. It should be like the water that we swim in. We don't even notice. And what you see with domestic abuse often is you're talking about somebody whose understanding of these relations has had to reconstruct because they've become abusive. And they've had to make decisions about ending a situation. And then when they challenge it, a lot of domestic abuse victims get absolutely fucking shocked when the people around them are not supportive of it and tell them to look again and, you know, have you given him a chance? Are you sure that's what it was? And they'll seek to find 1,000,001 ways to say, I think you must have this wrong. And the reason for that is the domestic abuse the victim has had to reconstruct their understanding of power dynamics to kind of get themselves out of this situation. But that hasn't happened for everybody else. And them challenging these power dynamics threatens other people's stuff. And people go into denial about this. And this is devastating for domestic abuse victims. This is actually devastating to find out that, you know, this person has hurt them. And then all of a sudden the people around them are saying, you know, are you sure? And trying to make them doubt themselves. And the reason for that is that their understanding of power is reconstructed and this other person's hasn't. And the reason for that is identity and power dynamics. Like, we will all seek to do that. And what we do is particularly around kind of functions like around safeguarding and around social care and around, you know, all these different things to do with power dynamics is we train people to reflect on their identity. And the reason for that is that your identity is about how you see yourself and how you see the world and what you see yourself connected to, and it shapes everything you do. Now I kind of have, this is not backed up, this is just my opinion, I think people will fight for three things. I think they'll fight for identity, attachment and survival, and generally when they're fighting for, they think they're fighting for survival, they're actually fighting for identity and attachment. And so if you take my reaction to working in system failure, when I realised we were working in system failure, not only could I see it because I was seeing it in terms of the system that had raised me, and all of a sudden all the things that mean that I'm alive and here with you as a person no longer exist for these young people. And this, to me, I've not settled since that day, I don't think. Like, the reaction that I've had to that, that's 8 years of this, of trying to get to the roots of that system failure, of how to fix it. That's not a normal reaction. That's a reaction to protect identity. That's a reaction to protect identity because A, I can't be the person who says that that's alright, but B, my identity is tied up in those legal baselines and the fact that we do that, and I have to. So for me, I'm not just saying that we don't protect these children, I'm saying that the system that protected me doesn't exist. This is major, but it's not rational. It's a distortion. I have to recognise that because it's not a rational reaction. And so what you learn in social work is that if you do not reflect on identity and the power that you have, because the power that you have is so extreme, you know, and when you're sat in a room with a 17-year-old mum where you misinterpreting something that she says, or seeing what you want to see, or not seeing something is the difference between her keeping her child or not, that shapes the way she sees you and every interaction with you, because she's fucking terrified of you and you are exercising extreme power in her life that she's going to have very limited. And you have to understand in that position that your perception is limited. And the extent, and when you start to learn the extent to which your perception is limited by your own identity, it's fucking terrifying. You know, even our memories, we reconstruct memories according to our own expectations. It's not like tape, it's not like a recording, this is a reconstruction. And you are seeing things in front of you And you have to be very careful and be aware that 9 times out of 10, you're not only seeing what's in front of you, you're seeing what's in your head. And I'm going to give you an example. I had a case where I had been involved in the removal of a child to foster parents from the mother's care, which was absolutely the right decision. Absolutely the right decision. And this child was thriving with these foster carers, absolutely thriving. And these foster carers were lovely, this child was lovely. Even actually Mum was coping better now that she didn't have that responsibility, and it was all like, and I was so entranced with how fucking good I was. And that I was on the stand at a set of proceedings, and these proceedings were, you know, the local authority by this point had spent a 5-figure sum, this child was in our care, you know, and I was on the stand. And Dad had turned up and asked to be assessed. And this dad had turned up and he was fucking vile. I'm not joking. This was not a man I even liked being sat in the same room as. He was horrible. He was a fucking twat. There's no two ways. He was a racist, horrible, nasty. I did not like this man. And all of a sudden I'm sat there and this child is with these lovely foster carers and she's thriving. And then this bloke turns up. And he says, I want to be considered. And I did the assessment. And I had fairly rapidly concluded that this child was better off with the carers. And then I stood on the stand and I was cross-examined. And about 4 questions in, I realised that I had really, well, not fucked up, but I had not seen what was in front of me. And I was asked whether, in a series of contacts, I had noticed the following things, and they gave me a series of things that I had not included in my assessment, that I had just omitted. And I had. And I hadn't omitted them deliberately. I had not seen them, because I had not been looking for them, because what I had gone into those contacts doing, whether I knew it or not, was this man had raised every fucking heckle, and I had just ignored the good stuff. And I was faced on the stand with the fact that I had just ignored this, and all of a sudden, I had a 5-figure sum for these proceedings, I had a manager who was sat over there, I had a judge. This was, I think, my first Austin, like, really early on, and I had literally, all of a sudden it was like a magic eye picture on the stand, and the things that I had been unable to see, all of a sudden I could see. And I had to say, actually, no, I didn't see that. Or I did not know that in my assessment. And when I was asked, why have you not done that? I was actually asked outright, was it because you didn't like him? And I had to answer, actually, that could have coloured my assessment. Now, my instinct in that moment was to go, actually, no. Because I'll sit there, you should see me, I'm a twat. I'll sometimes argue for the sake of arguing, because I know I can win pretty much any argument, and I'll just carry on. But to do that here, whether I like this man or not, would cause such a savage wound to this man and this child, and such savage damage to this child's future and to his life, that at that point you have to go, no, I have not seen. And this is really, really, really difficult. When you are faced with 2 people, one who is like you, who you share lots of things with, you maybe have an institutional, you maybe are colleagues, or you share enough things that you're similar, and that you don't even have to acknowledge the things that make you similar, and you're faced with somebody who is not, and the person who is not like you accuses the person that you identify with of something, you will give that person the benefit of the doubt. 99 times out of 100. Really. And no matter how hard you try, you will do that. And what you learn over a period of time, because these decisions are really high stakes, you learn how limited your own perspective is, and how limited you are by what you see. Everything you see is shaped by who you are. None of us is exempt from doing this. And then what you also get to see in social work is that everybody does this. And this is actually really difficult stuff to know. I find it gets more difficult as I get older to know some of this stuff and to see it all the time. But we're retaining these functions around social work and around, in the health service and in education, people who know this. And our safeguarding systems are built around this learning, incrementally over a long period of time. We've learned We know that when a child says, X did X to me, that not only, that everybody's response will be to go into denial and to try and find 1,000,001 reasons why that could not possibly have happened, because to say that that happened would threaten structures around themselves. And what most people do, and we don't tell ourselves, we don't do this, they will make an equation in their head where they will evaluate the weight of that child's power against everything that was jeopardized by believing that child. And until we had safeguarding and actual learning embedded in law, we would just not believe that child. And the other thing that you have to learn is that you identify as good. If you identify as good, you want to identify as good. We all want to identify as good. We all want to be good people. Even the worst people want to see themselves as good people. And unless you know, when you're doing that kind of assessment, that actually about half the time you're wrong, you're exercising power that is savage and harmful, always. So even when you're doing it well-intentioned, you're causing harm. You have to keep this at the forefront of your mind, because the minute you start telling yourself you identify as good, and people threaten that identity as good by saying, that was really harmful, you will seek to protect it. Now, what's interesting about the left, if you read Owen Jones's Chavs and the Establishment, you'll notice it's an entire protection of identity. He's constructed a false narrative entirely around an identity that he has for himself as good. In the Establishment, he doesn't even mention the Guardian as part of the Establishment. In Chavs, he's constructed a narrative where, since Thatcher was handed a mandate by his peers, a working class he can't see as anything but objects have been waiting for him and the left. And the outcome of that is that because Owen has done this, Owen will now attack anybody who discusses the actual system failure that's caused by austerity. He'll attack anybody who's living with austerity, because his identity as the left is what he'll reproduce. And because the left do this so strongly, they plant themselves onto everything they touch and they just reproduce their own identity. And what that means is a class structure. So what you're talking about is a bunch of Oxbridge boys who reproduce their identity and then attack anybody who kind of challenges it. Well, we know now. We've had 70 years to learn why we don't do this. And we certainly don't do this when we're dealing with people with a lot less power. And what used to happen before the welfare state was the widespread abuse of people by people who were exercising power and identified as good. Now, the kind of reflection that I'm talking about on identity is a lot easier for somebody who's exercising power like a social worker, because you actually have to all the time, just to function. You have to do this. You're making very serious decisions. And this reflection is actually forced by how high the stakes are, and most people kind of don't do this. And one of the things that's very difficult is learning how we all go in circles to protect identity all the time. We reproduce our class identity, we reproduce family structures effortlessly, we reproduce these things effortlessly because our identity is intact. And when somebody challenges our identity, they're saying, you might have to change the way you do your entire life. And we don't want to do that, so we will react to protect ourselves against that. And I think identity is very much at the core of this. What you see on Twitter is a place where identities are formed without context. And you see how quickly that turns into tribalism and abusing people and setting up objects to abuse. And I think Twitter is actually a really useful fishbowl to watch this, because it's just over and over again, identities form, and then identities have to lash out at anybody who reminds them their identity is false. It's partially why trans rights activism has been so focused on, I must erase, I must target women, mothers, lesbians, because these are people who are who are defined by things to do with their biology and female body, and their lives are shaped by it. And for these batshit activists, those people remind them that they are not that. And so they're a danger to them. And one of the things, it's very much like narcissistic abuse. If somebody